Thanks, Sarah. And thanks to all my peers and the Business and Climate Environmental Lab for coming together and making this event possible during Climate Week. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to share some of the research I've been engaged in at the ESG Analytics Lab that relates to the financial impact of climate risk. I want to start with a sobering statistic. And that statistic is that in order to reduce net greenhouse gas emissions to zero by 2050, the estimates on the CapEx required range from $30 to $60 trillion. Now, that sounds pretty daunting. When we look at the optimistic numbers of how many assets under management actually care about ESG factors, care about climate risk, you come up with a number around 35 trillion. If that number were actually accurate, and a fraction of those funds were funneled into CapEx to support the climate transition over the coming decades, we might actually already be on the path to net zero. But we're not. The reality lags far beyond these headline numbers. Most of the investment that's going into ESG funds are simply going into tracking funds offered by BlackRock iShares that track major indices and differ from them only in that they don't buy tobacco, weapons manufacturers, and in some cases, coal, oil, and gas producers. Green bonds, impact funds with a climate theme, and other climate-related financial instruments are experiencing rapid growth, but it's from a much smaller base. If you add the assets under management and all those instruments together, you come up with tens of billions of dollars. So there's the rub, the gap, the difference between tens of billions and tens of trillions. Order of 1,000 difference. If we could increase the fund flows into ESG funds by 2 orders of magnitude, it would make a difference, but we'd still be tens of trillions of dollars of capital short. The argument I'm making is that the only feasible pathway to achieve net zero is to not just rhetorically, but to actually harness the power of capital markets at scale. And in order to do that, we need to move from the current way of measuring a firm's climate impacts and ESG impacts more broadly to a new way of seeing value. The existing metrics that companies are using, they're based on rating companies on 30 different dimensions and aggregating them into a composite score that measures the purity of the corporations via some proprietary algorithm devised by the data vendor. The scores have no correlation with each other, and they have no known correlation of financial performance over time. Instead, we need to find a way to link a company's emissions, a company's ESG performance to its financial value. And as the last presentation highlighted, the first way to do that, or the best way to do that, is to not rely on emojis, not rely on some different unit of analysis, but use the same unit of account. The same unit of account that's used to measure financial value, dollars. I've spent a good part of the last year working with Engine Number One, their data scientists and consultants, to devise a new methodology entitled the Total Value Framework that proceeds from the simple observation that the best way to capture these impacts, companies' harm caused to stakeholders under some conditions, those stakeholders will rise up, mobilize, and impose a cost on the company's shareholders. They're moderators to that relationship. They're contingencies based on regulation, based on customer beliefs, based on stakeholder concern, based on technology, based on competition. But the basic premise is to link dollars of harm through carbon emissions and other ESG factors to the current and future profits and losses of companies, and thereby to an investment thesis. How does the methodology do, you might ask? Well, it outperforms every other known ESG metric in generating an alpha signal over the last 10 years. This logic that was developed in the Total Value Framework is the same one that drove the analysis done by Engine Number One's analysts to demonstrate that ExxonMobil was destroying shareholder value by not adequately preparing for the climate transition. Almost 100 pages of publicly available analysis disassembling ExxonMobil's financial statements and disclosures, demonstrating why and how they were poorly managed, poorly governed, and obfuscating their failures. The analysis overcame the resistance of the management, overcame the resistance of the board, and convinced the majority of investors to vote with Engine Number One in an epic proxy contest to replace 25% of ExxonMobil's board. How did you vote in that campaign? Or should I ask, how did your asset manager vote? Or do you even know? Did they take into account your preferences or their interests? How would you have liked them to vote? And what could you do to bring your investments more in line with those preferences? Engine Number One's launched a new ETF that gives you an opportunity to ensure that your shares, even in an index fund with low fees, vote the way you want it to. It's the first passively managed fund with constructive and at times active engagement. Some of my ongoing research and that of other scholars at the lab studies how and when activism, innovation, and product offerings like this ETF and better data can inform alpha generating or risk reducing investment strategies that can allow all of us as researchers, shareholders, and citizens to have a seat at the table in corporate decisions which impact climate. We can't run away from the problem of climate change or wash our hands of it with simple divestment strategies. We need to prove the business case of investing in a manner that brings us closer to net zero. In order to address the failures of capitalism to address climate risk, we actually need to harness the power of capital, and that requires a new way of seeing value. Thanks.